Fantastic. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this presentation of Mapping Humanitarian Tech, presented by ISOC-DC, ISOC-New York, and Access Now. My name is Chelsea Horn. I am a senior professorial lecturer at American University. I am also co-convener of the ISOC-DC chapter. So I am very excited to introduce Giulio Coppi, who is going to be presenting the findings of his report. Giulio has over 15 years of international experience across the humanitarian, human rights, and academic sectors. He has worked with NRC, ICRC, OCHA, and OHCHR, among others, and has experience responding to crisis contexts in several countries. At Access Now, Giulio is responsible for monitoring and advising on digital rights in the context of conflict and disaster, advancing protection from digital harm through international humanitarian law norms, customs, and principles, and promoting ethical approaches to the design and delivery of technological systems by private companies. So the structure of how we're going to do this presentation is that Giulio will give us first a rundown of some of the key findings, key insights. Then we will have some discussion between the two of us, and we're going to save the last 20 minutes for Q&A. So even though we have that dedicated time for question and answers, we do invite and encourage you to put into the chat any questions that you may have. If you would like very brief clarifications as we're doing the discussion and presentation, please feel free to ask those and we'll do our best to address. But as you have questions, please put them in the chat. That way then we can just launch right into it at the end of the our discussion that we have here. So with that, I will pass it over to Giulio. So tell us about this report that you've put forward.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thanks everyone for joining and the Internet Society for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a double pleasure because it means that the report is out. We've been working on this for quite some time, and it has been delayed. It was supposed to be published in December. We decided to give extra time because some of the people that we interviewed and some of the organizations that we reached out to really insisted for providing thorough feedback, pushing back on some arguments, wanting to contribute on other parts. So we took a decision to give as much time as possible, but that dragged quite for some time. So I'm very happy to be finally out there discussing the report. That is a work of love coming out of a passion for a sector that I've been into for quite some time now. Is a report on the role and the struggle and the potential of a partnership between different sectors, a partnership between corporate and humanitarian actors, a partnership between the academia and the corporate, everyone. It's a mix, and you will see going through the report that it's not just divided by a few areas of work, but it's also a story of how some relationships have evolved and how some of these partnerships have generated results or haven't in the other case. So to make a long story short, this report was and is a contribution to a sector to try and provide a bird's eye view about where we are in terms of handling complex technologies in the most sensitive scenarios in the world.
Fantastic. So let's start at the beginning here. What inspired the idea for this project and to do this research and this study? Because usually it's when we observe something that's happening in the world. So tell us a little bit about how you got started with this project.
As I mentioned, I really wanted to do something like that for quite some time. I never really had the opportunity. And when I joined Access Now, I finally got the chance to do it. They were looking for doing some foundational work for exploring the digital side of human rights in conflict. And they realized that trying to have an idea about who does what where was the first step, was the first logical step in this process. But as we started, we realized that it was not that easy. So we had to structure in a different way. But the idea was never to have this kind of gotcha moment where you point your finger and say, oh, you are doing a bad job, or you are the bad guys, or you are exploiting this field, or you are abusing your power in this field. That is not, and it was not the idea of the report. And the report is mostly non-judgmental, except for a couple of things that are a little bit, let's say, off the chart. But it tries to be as non-judgmental as possible. We try to offer everyone from the academia, the corporate, and the nonprofit sector a holistic and a matter-of-fact perspective that we hope will be helpful in building better humanitarian technology, a better tech environment for everyone for the future.
And in the executive summary of the report, you mentioned, and this is a quote, that we believe that two converging processes are unfolding: the transformation of some humanitarian actors into tech service providers, and the transformation of tech companies into de facto humanitarian service providers, end quote. So could you say a bit more about what this means and the findings of your report overall for the future of humanitarian aid?
This is something that, in my opinion, has not been discussed a lot in the public discussion of the report itself. So I'm happy that you're bringing this up. A few people have raised their eyebrows when they've heard that or read that the first time. It's like, what do you mean by that? It doesn't make sense. The truth is, we are used to imagine humanitarians in a certain way. We are used to imagine corporate in a certain way. But when you look at how companies and humanitarians interact in certain crisis scenarios, when you look at new emerging actors that out of their kindness of heart and true motivation, they try to bring assistance in a different way, to break the paradigm, to go against the rules and do something different. You notice that that kind of stereotype doesn't match anymore. So there are humanitarian organizations that have very few field teams, as they were called. They don't have a lot of field coordinators, of land rovers. They don't have a lot of field offices with admins and logs, and they have engineers. They do have data analysts. They do monitor cash flows. They use mobile money solution. They interact more frequently in a way with their tech counterpart and their tech stack than they do with some of the field accountabilities and the field accounting that humanitarians are used to deal with. And this is interesting because it kind of generates a question about what is humanitarianism when it runs on digital means and digital channels more than it runs on physical cars and physical roads. Does it still has to respond to humanitarian principles? If you ask me, I would say yes, but what will that look like? And conversely, when you have NGOs that are traditional, but they are losing ground in getting access to communities, and they're increasingly expelled and put in danger, and they pull back, and they recur and depend more and more on digital solutions, such as, again, remote cache solutions, remote sensing for assessment and evaluation, blockchain, AI, big data, you name it. What does that mean for the kind of role of these organizations? Who's doing the lift? Who's doing the heavy lifting of this humanitarian action? And the burden is sometimes, in a few cases, in a few contexts, shifting. You will see that basically without the technology, the humanitarian could not do their job. So in a way, the essential part of humanitarianism starts to being a little bit questionable. But then, again, the same question: what does that mean in terms of who's doing the heavy lifting here? Do they adhere to the humanitarian principles? No, very often no. So how do we go about that? Do we suddenly consider that humanitarian principles are not that important anymore? Or maybe do they take a different shape when we talk about companies in conflict? Or maybe we need to look at them in a different way. Or maybe we need to sit at the table and discuss how do we do things differently. So this is the sense. And it's, as I mentioned, this is a foundational work. It's the beginning of a reflection and of a discussion.
So maybe we can pull back for a second too, because we're seeing like why this matters and why it's important. Can you give us like a big picture overall look into what are some of the key insights and the key findings? So to just very first broadly, and then we can go in more granular into some of the way and unpack the report. But like, for example, if I were just to ask you, because it's a 70-page report, which if you guys have the, maybe we can drop it into the chat as well to have a link to the report, but it's on the Eventbrite page that we have. So please take a look at the report itself. It's 70 pages. It's very thorough. So if how would you distill what is a very dense methodological work, and how would you explain it in layman's terms to us?
I will explain that there is a sector that deals with the most fringe and the most delicate and the most sensitive situations related to the hardest to solve problems in a fast-paced environment where things happen very quickly, where situations can degenerate very fast, where data is extremely rare and extremely valuable for some actors. And we do have competing priorities and competing needs that come together to try to answer to some of those needs by these people. And the report tries to analyze from the moment that these actors, external actors, engage with the local communities that are in need, what happened to that data? What happened to those systems? What happened to those tools? And we crawl back up the chain, the food chain of the data pipeline to try and understand, okay, what kind of actors are involved at different levels? Who's providing those services? What kind of agreements do they have among them? And is that data going from A to Z or A to B and then B to C? And we are trying to draw a picture of how much do we know about what's going on in this journey. So in layman's term, I would say it's a journey. It's the journey of the data that we're trying to track, the journey of the data from the people that are experiencing need and vulnerability up to the cloud and to the silver towers of the data processing systems and the commodified digital economy. And we try to do that painting and try to understand what comes out of it.
And you've already been hinting at this, so I'm just going to ask you to say it a bit more explicitly, which is like, these are clearly critical issues. Like we're looking at humanitarian aid and looking at vulnerable communities in particular. So why is it so important for us, and us being a large societal us, to address these issues? And again, with the understanding that we know that this does matter, if you could just tell us a bit more about like, why does this matter so much? And why should this be getting more attention than it is right now?
Because the truth is we need technology. The truth is we need it. And not because I say so. It's because if we pull technology out of the picture right now, first of all, we're not offering people that are experiencing vulnerability the best assistance that we can possibly give them. And also because very often the geopolitical security and safety challenges are so dire that without the support of the technology, it will just not be viable anymore, at least at this scale. The amount of crisis, the intensity of the crisis, the violence, the level of brutality is so intense and becoming so more intense every day, unfortunately, that it is hard to imagine how would we go about without using remote cash transfer. And these also allowed, and I'm just making cash as an example but for a reason, because for example, providing cash has been one of the key struggle and battle that has been done to ensure that people have the liberty and the freedom to use the resources that are given in an autonomous way with agency. But this was also made possible by the use of mobile cash solution. So you don't have to go around with literal banknotes, and it makes the whole process easier. So just to give you a simple example, that is why it is important, because we need it. We need technology, and we can't do without at this stage. But the problem is that if we do it uncritically, if we do it like sleepwalking into partnerships, into thinking that we just strike an agreement with a small tech company or a big tech company and that's it, without considering the whole ecosystem, the digital and data ecosystem that runs around it, then we might be up for a big surprise at some point. our duty is to call the attention of everyone to say, we are part of something bigger.
Fantastic. So now, like, as we have the big picture, we have the umbrella, we're looking at this whole scale. Let's go a little bit more into what the report is looking at explicitly. So a couple of, maybe I can prompt you along the way. We can break this down here. So first, what exactly and who exactly did you talk to? In the report, it does mention this, but like, how did you build your design of the study here? So who were you talking to?
Let's start from a very interesting caveat. The report was not supposed to be like that at the beginning. The report was supposed to be a who does what where. It was supposed to be a portfolio, technically a mapping. We couldn't do it. It was impossible. And I honestly, I throw a challenge out there. I'll pay you a coffee, a tea, a wine, or a beer, anyone listening to this call or this presentation, if you can put together a portfolio of projects that are out there by putting how much do they cost, how much was the financial investment, how much was the pro bono or the service-based contribution, how many people worked on it, how many people received benefits from it, how long did it last, when did it start, is it still running today? Yes, no. What is the exact tech stack that was used? If you can answer to those points for, let's say, five projects, I'll, the coffee and tea or teas on me. It's just impossible. We just don't have 90% of those information. Maybe some NGOs, small NGOs, might have a couple of information about past projects where they are extremely precise because they have a reporting to a donor to do. But it's honestly impossible to imagine that at scale. Organizations are extremely, extremely sloppy in documenting who they work with and if they're still doing it today or not. Sometimes they throw their corporate partners or their tech partners out there, and that's it. Like, we did that with them. You don't know if it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if it's still up and running, if it was just a pilot. Impossible to say. Sometimes there is a big, drama about a pilot, and then you don't hear about it anymore. You don't know, did it become something else? Is it still like agonizing somewhere? So you don't know. It's just impossible. So we had to pivot, and we had to pivot quickly. So we basically decided to adopt this journey view. It's like, let's skip that. Let's not do the accounting of the project management. Let's just focus on what can we see about the partnerships that were done and how do they interact with each other. And it was amazing because that allowed us to get an amazing perspective over the whole data pipeline that leads from the people up to the organizations, and then across the organizations, and then up to the cloud. And it was, and it was amazing to then break it down into silos. It was just almost natural. So it shaped up pretty nicely. It'd say, okay, so what happens? The first thing, data collection and communication of information with communities. So that became the first bucket. And then the second one is, well, we need to take it out of there. So connectivity, and through the connectivity, the security of the line, so the cybersecurity aspect could have gone also in another bucket, but that's for another day. And then once it gets to a database, what happens? That it gets matched with an identity. So we focus on the digital ID and biometric side. And finally, it needs to be stored somewhere. It needs to be processed. It needs to be made valuable from an analysis perspective. So advanced analytics, AI, and cloud processing. It kind of shaped up nicely. And we had this moment of Zen when we realized we never really thought about that like this. Like, we never really analyzed in a linear way, in a dynamic way, the experience of the people through the lens of technology. So that's what we did in the end.
Okay, and what you did is you just broke down for us what the study part of the project looks at, which is these 4 distinct parts that you just outlined, which is collecting the data, moving the data, matching the data, and transforming the data. And in the report, you have a series of 9 case studies for each of the, well, not for each, for throughout demonstrating these 4 distinct parts. So maybe we can go even more granular here and talk about one of the case studies that you did, maybe 1 or 2. And I think perhaps a good one to look at is the case study about Starlink, because this is one that I think most people will have at least heard of the name, be familiar with in at least in concept. So could you walk us through the case study of Starlink that you mentioned in your report?
Yes, in the case of Starlink, it's an interesting one because it kind of sums up the problem that we have as a community in the way we deal with technology. So Starlink was hailed, and is still hailed, as a sort of a tech savior by a lot of people for the way that the system allowed families and local communities to keep communications running in some scenarios, including in Ukraine after the full-scale invasion by Russia. This is hard to dispute, and it's not our point to go against people's opinion and feelings. Like, we are happy if people were able to connect. But then we start looking at it from the humanitarian perspective, and we see that the kind of picture that shapes up is quite different. So some terminals were indeed used, but not to a scale that is, I would say, ground shaking. And then they slowly disappear from the radar, replaced by more traditional solutions. So you start asking yourself, okay, but then what is the catch exactly? Like, what is the role? Why we did it, and why it was done like that, and why it was not continued? And you don't really get a clear answer. It all murky. And then you start looking around and you see that, for example, other crises and other situations where the same solution was requested was either denied or was smuggled, because Starlink is present in a lot of places where there is conflict and is not supposed to be. And if there is something that Starlink has shown over and over again, is that they can break it if they want. So there is this kind of shady relationship with terminals that are popping up in places without a clear, transparent agreement of terms of service. And they are used for, they are used sometimes by the emergency telecommunication cluster, and they are public in the way they use systems. You can find it on paper. It's not a secret. But then to understand exactly what kind of difference did it make, and then why, for example, not in other countries that might need it just as well. That's where it becomes shady. That's where you understand that the sector is very quick and get excited about silver bullet solution. But then when it comes to building a relationship, that's where it falls. And the case of Starlink, again, it's extremely emblematic because it creates a friction. And this is not expressly written into the report, but it's something that we document more and more and over and over and over. It creates a lot of friction between the humanitarian actors that want to provide connectivity to the local communities, that want to bring solutions to the needs of the people, and the community that is asking, but they have it, but they have why we can't have it? Why can't us? And there is no answer to that, because it's mercurial. It's based on a whim. It's based on arbitrary decisions. It's based on shady agreements and terms of engagement. And it creates this friction. And you try to build maybe longer term solutions with telco providers, with other, mobile wheels, other kind of systems. And people go back, but, I've seen that works. Starlink works here. So I want that one. I don't want you to build something in 5 years. I don't want you to build something in 3 months. I don't want you to find something else. I want that. And that's how you start to realize that is a market engagement process. So as a sector, and this is the case of Starlink in the report, we need to ask ourselves, are we part of a market engagement process aimed at market dominance sometimes? And this is not just the case of Starlink. Are we part of a market dominance gig? Or are we in for calling out bad behaviors and being transparent about the way we do things? And just to conclude on the Starlink thing, I heard at least a couple of other crises where this solution was provided, unofficially to humanitarian groups and then bricked because it was supposed to be used in a way that was not geopolitically aligned with the company's interest. And again, it's not wrong. It was bricked because they didn't have the licenses, so it was legally correct, but it still made it in the country in the first place at the beginning. So this is something we call out, and we want more transparency in the way that we deal with tech providers. We want to be deliberate in the way we engage with companies, and we want companies to be transparent in the way that they engage with us.
Great, thank you for that. And now, as I mentioned, there are 9 case studies in the report. So this is just one of the 9 that are included here. So if we had time, we would go through more of them because each of them offers a fascinating look into the idea of collection, moving, transferring data here. So it's really an interesting take on this. So just to move forward, because I'm keeping track of time here, looking at your conclusions that you have in the report, you've identified 9 key points. While, of course, all of these are critical and they need to be addressed, which one or 2 of them stand out to you as either the most important for us to address first, or perhaps, and maybe these are different, the conclusions that are often overlooked by others? So either whichever ones are most pressing and urgent to address first, or the ones that others are not really noticing or they're missing and that they need to be addressed for that reason.
I will flag the first 3 conclusions. That is a reason why they're not in order of importance, but in my opinion, those that are the top 3 or top 4 are the key ones, or the one that we are most concerned about. At least myself, I'm the most concerned about. The hybridization I already mentioned. The fact that this is not necessarily concerning, but it's something we need to be aware of because it changes the framework. If we change the nature of humanitarian engagement, we need to be realistic and to say, what does that change in terms of the principles, the values? Shall we renegotiate that? Shall we discuss that? Shall we add them to the contracts, to the terms of service? How do we go about this? And this is linked to the third point in the conclusion, the polarization. And the truth is, let me take that back. It's linked to the second and the third, the concentration and the polarization at the same time, because the tech spectrum is getting extremely polarized, and not because it's something that we do or we decide, but it's just because there is a concentration process going on inside and outside of the humanitarian sector. There are fewer big tech actors that are buying up big time, and they are basically the only one that are providing big services across this data pipeline that we tracked. And by accident, they also provide services to the defense sector worldwide. So the principle of neutrality that wants you to not take side, the principle of independence that tells you that you're not depending on a specific actor in dictating your policies and your priorities. Well, if you depend on a tech stack because your whole IT system depends on that tech solution, but you cannot engage in a certain country because it's under embargo and that company cannot enter that country, that is not compatible with the principle of independence. It's not you deciding that you don't work there. It's just you can't get there. They don't allow you to bring your mobile, your computer, your database. You cannot work there because of geopolitical sanctions that are affecting your tech provider. So I'm trying to break down something that is all tangled. So the hybridization means there is shifting responsibilities without necessarily taking over the ethical and value frameworks that come with them, with the respective fields. The concentration means that we are relying on an increasingly small amount of big tech providers or tech providers overall for cash transfers, for database management, for cloud and hosting, for AI services and advanced analytics. And the polarization means that those few actors are also providing services to those engaged in the conflict. One concrete example is that I was recently in a conference where one representative, a senior manager from a humanitarian organization, got really pale because they realized that the satellite communication system that they use is exactly the same broadband that sends military signals. And it never occurred that they are sharing the same airspace for sending extremely sensitive protected humanitarian data and targeting information for military action. That's how it is today. We might work towards a different solutions, and now we are starting that discussion. But this is how it is today.
And I have two more questions to move us forward. So I'm just giving us a check with that. So if you have any questions or concerns, not concerns, questions that the audience may have, please put them in the chat. I see that we have at least one right now. So just giving you fair warning so that way then when we go to Q&A, we can jump right into it. So two more from me and then we'll go to Q&A from the audience. So you started hinting at some of the challenges and obstacles here. So while we were more granular in looking at some of the case studies, let's pull back out. So coming back to some of the key insights and key findings, what did you find are the overall challenges and obstacles to humanitarian aid and private tech that you've observed from this study?
I would say that one of the biggest challenges is the reluctancy from and the resistance from tech companies to engage openly in this discussion. It was extremely hard to get any kind of answer from most tech companies. And I know that there are so many good people there that try to do well. But I also know that because of the polarization issue, because of the way that the capitalist and venture capital structure of the world is running right now, these companies are not comfortable in being open about their engagement in conflict areas. It has consequences on their stocks, on their shareholders, on their board meetings, exposure, liability, all sorts of things. So we need to find a better way to go about this. It's not enough to be good-hearted and to do things for good. We need to also do it in the right way. But that also means that maybe those companies will need to face the fact that either you want to be a humanitarian-facing organization and be transparent about the way you do it, or maybe it's better not to do it at all and just be, have a client relationship or something like that. But the truth is, the biggest challenge right now to me is to establish this relationship of trust with companies. It's extremely complicated. And I've seen one question popping up in the chat about what are the next steps. This is one of the next steps. One of the next steps for us is to try and build that relationship of trust or trust-based relationship with corporate actors, not just with humanitarian actors. We need to break that kind of silence and be more transparent and find ways to be more transparent about these kind of things. And on the obstacle side, I would say it's the sloppiness of the humanitarian sector. It's painful. Like it's not, because people are so busy with so many different things they have to follow. They sometimes don't even think about how important it is to put it out there. Very few humanitarian organizations are public about their tech stack. This is insane. Why? You should be proud of it. You should show what you have achieved. Everybody is, and this is also one of the key takeaway for me, is that this kind of stereotype of the humanitarian sector being led by troglodytes, being, an absolutely basic sector where people do rough stuff with whatever they have, quick and dirty kind of 80s mentality. This is motivated partly by a turbo tech agenda that tries to sell more tech, more data, more tools. The truth is, humanitarian experts, humanitarian staff and organizations, when they need something, when they see a need for a technology, they're already on it. They have been doing AI and chatbots and stuff for 10 years now. It's not new. We've been doing that forever. When we need it, we do it. The problem is that we don't talk about it. We're not public. We're not transparent in the way we do things. And this is a problem.
Okay. So it's always helpful to know what the challenges are. And because I do like to end things on a positive note, as you do with your report, you give us several recommendations. And you mentioned you addressed there the idea of building more trust. Your report breaks it down into several different stakeholders. So we have for the donors, for the humanitarian community, for the tech companies, for local actors and communities. So could you break down maybe a couple of the recommendations that you're offering based off the findings of your report?
I will say that for the donor's perspective, it's important to be aware of the complexity that lies in funding digital solutions. And that when they fund a digital solution, it comes with responsibilities that are way beyond the GDPR requirements. So we suggest that donors do request that at least human rights-based assessment, protection-based assessment are run on the system, not just GDPR-based evaluations. This is on the donor side, but there is like a long list, but this is just to name a few. On the humanitarian community, we suggest that the humanitarian community fill the gap that exists with the human rights community that has been fighting for a business and human rights framework for so long. They are used to challenge things. They are used to call out companies when they don't behave properly. They are used to demand supply chain testing, visibility, and accountability. While in the humanitarian sector, we just sign a contract, and what's behind, we maybe run our CTO, counterterrorism checklist, if we're required for accountability reasons, and that's it. We don't ask questions about who's in the supply chain, who's implied, and who's involved in this process. At least maybe we do, but we don't talk about it, which is, again, going back to the problem. We don't really say what we do. And on the company side, we strongly suggest, again, to bring whatever comes from the business and human rights framework into the humanitarian sphere. It doesn't stop at the door. Whatever they do for human rights, they should do tenfold for humanitarian crisis. While right now it's the opposite. If you look at the business and human rights report by these companies, you won't find their humanitarian engagement. This is ridiculous. This is nonsensical. And finally, we also have recommendations and suggestions for even for communities and for people to start demanding your rights, enforce your rights whenever you can. Reach out to those organizations that are strong on digital rights to protect your rights if you feel that you've been wronged, to demand visibility over your data. And this is also something that, unfortunately, many organizations on the human rights and humanitarian side of the story understand, is that things move only when there is accountability through a court, only when you're called out for something. And then you start adjusting policies and realizing that maybe you need to do something about it. So we strongly encourage communities to reach out to digital rights community-led and grassroots-led organizations. And potentially, if they fear for their digital integrity and safety, they can reach out to our Access Now helpline. There are several channels, and these are our recommendations to really care. Don't give up their rights on their digital dimension just because they're in need. Their rights do not stop because they are in need of something.
Thank you. And now we're going to move to the audience Q&A, and we already have a robust series of questions here, so I think we can jump straight into them. And this is actually a good segue with your response just now. We have from Heather a question asking, what are the next steps for Access Now with your recommendations?
Okay, so the next steps, the first thing is to follow up on the report with all the different organizations that were, first of all, involved in the report by providing inputs and feedback. Those that were not involved, because for some reason they did not respond, we will go back again and we'll try to build bridges, and we'll try to say, look, again, there is no gotcha intention. We don't want to call out people because we really want to build a good dynamic here. So we'll go back to everyone. We'll go back in public spaces, in private spaces, in bilateral. We'll open bilateral channel. We really want to foster a climate of trust. And with donors especially, we want to help them in being more deliberate in the way that they fund digital transformation. One interesting thing is that in the feedback rounds that we received on the report prior to publication, at least a couple of humanitarian organizations, they asked us, can you please stress in the recommendations that donors should fund cybersecurity? Because the truth is, they don't. And how do you want to have a solid digital pipeline, a solid digital humanitarian ecosystem, if you don't secure the gates, if you don't secure the pipes? And yeah, so these made it into the recommendations in the end. Next step, talking to the companies and the donors.
We have a next question from Ray asking, how much overlap is there between organizations building similar or identical bespoke systems?
This is a long discussion in the sector. Has been going on forever. The discussion between those who say just buy whatever off-the-shelf solutions out there, and those say no, you need to build your own because you can own the data, you have agency, you can protect it. To be honest, there is a lot of similarities. There is a lot of things, but what I would say is critical is the spirit and the transparency and the coherence of the policies. What I'm more worried about, to be honest, is not the redundancy of several systems. If I may, I would be very happy to see 1,000 different systems that are maybe interconnected, interoperable with standards, solid standards and policies and practices, rather than a single company managing everything with zero oversight and policies for redress and accountability by the implementing actors. It depends. So I see a lot of redundancy, but if you read the report, you will see that the redundancy is a lot here at the top of the pyramid. The closer you get to the communities, there's a lot of redundancy, a lot of small data collection systems, a lot of big data collection systems, a lot of hybrid solutions, and then it gets thinner and thinner and thinner until you get to the top of the pyramid, where you have very few actors, where all the redundant data collected at the bottom flows. So I'm more worried about that top rather than the bottom. Of course, the bottom is part of the problem, data minimization and everything. But that's where it becomes really tricky, when it all flows up.
Our next question is from Caroline. In your study, did you come across any process that worked in relation to openness and transparency, as well as inclusive design with humanitarian and non-humanitarian actors? What did this look like? Or is this wishful thinking in our current situation with polarization?
I think ODK is a good example. ODK is a good example. The data collection system is a very good example of a positive dynamic that allows a socially minded enterprise to provide services to the humanitarian field and to the humanitarian sector as a whole. I would say that 90% of the data work of the humanitarian system relies on some ODK related product, be it Kobo, be it another solutions, and a part of it on Excel, on Microsoft Excel, but a good chunk of it relies on ODK. And this is a good example. They are completely transparent. They publish their pipeline of project development and software development. They are public about their screw ups if they happen. They have public calls. They are now launching a new session of public sessions. A new round of public sessions where people can attend and listen to how they choose their priorities. This is a very good example. Another good example was Frontline SMS before it shut down. So there are good examples. Now, I wouldn't say that this is replicable across the scale for every single solution, but it becomes very tricky when private companies, especially big tech companies, are involved, because that's where the openness completely shut down.
All right. And our next question is from Liam. I am wondering about accountability to affected communities, something we in the humanitarian world were not doing a great job with, even pre-digital. What can be done to increase reporting mechanisms about harm or remedies for different types of harm?
That's a tough one. A part of the report is exactly about this, and it mentions that this is not new, as Liam mentions in the question. This is not new. We've been struggling as a sector with this forever. We're not good. We're not even decent at that. I would say there are two ways, a pessimistic and an optimistic way to answer this question. And that's why we're doing this, because we want to be optimistic and push for the positive outcome. The risk, I start from the risk and then I'll say the positive one, is that if we continue this way with no policies for redress, notably, no policies, and this is all coming from the human rights framework. This is nothing new again. If you take the business and human rights framework, there is a whole chunk, there are two big fat sections on redress and remedy. We don't have that in the humanitarian sector. We just don't like it. We don't consider it important. We don't think it's our job. We can do no wrong, right? So first, do no harm. So harm does not exist. Basically, this is the problem. If there, we are at a crossroad. We either continue developing technologies thinking we'll never do any harm, or we set up policies for accountability that needs to consider redress and remedy. As we say in the report, and as I've written over and over again, you don't have a right if you cannot protect it or enforce it. A right that you cannot protect or enforce does not exist. So when you go back, everyone here, including myself, to our own organizations, think, do we have those policies in place to make sure that if we do something wrong, these people have a right they can protect against us? If not, then all this blah, blah about accountability will go nowhere. And this is even more true in the tech sector, where you can always put the blame on Microsoft or this other actor or that other actor.
Our next question is from Pavel. From your interviews, have you found that humanitarian organizations engage in some form of threat modeling for the tech solutions?
Yes, some of them do. And there is, for example, in the report, you can find a reference to UNHCR that is building a human rights impact assessment that is also based on threat modeling. When I was in the digital transformation of programs, I was doing myself the threat modeling for my own organization to try and design. I still have the matrix with me. One day I'll maybe publish it if it's useful. There are examples, but again, they're not public. It's not something that is out there that you can easily find. But yes, there is a threat model. There are a few examples, not so many to be honest, but there are a few examples of threat modeling that exist.
I'm going to skip the next two and come back to them just to make sure we get to first questions from everyone first. We have a comment first, and then we'll go to a question afterwards. Sylvia mentions a splendid presentation, thought-provoking as always. I do not have a question, but a comment on a comment on how the report helps us digital ID researchers understand how our topic cannot anymore be seen in isolation from research on digital rights. Your examination of scope and primes on page 31 of the report is paradigmatic of this. Well done on this labor of love.
Can I add something just on this one? Because it's not a question that it raises a very valid point. And Sylvia's mentioning something that didn't make it into a report, but it made it into my findings when I present this in detail, section by section. If you want to dig into something that is really annoying and really concerning, is the mingling of digital ID, cloud, and AI. Because if you look, that's where the consolidation and cache. That's where a lot of this consolidation happen. A lot of these functions are being sometimes through biometrics. Biometrics is becoming the cornerstone of a lot of different services, most of them cloud-based. And that's where it becomes really creepy. Sorry, no.
No, don't apologize. I think that the comment was very productive. So that's really helpful and very insightful. Our next question is from Hisham. This is a very important discussion, and thank you for this report. Is there an effort to advocate and push for changes in policy in big tech based on these recommendations? I know ICRC has had some digital advocacy efforts in Silicon Valley.
As I was mentioning, we will try to establish a trust-based relationship with companies and make them understand why we are worried about some of these trends. We will also talk to humanitarian actors who talk to their tech providers and check where do they stand in terms of some of these concerns. It's up to everyone. We already got some good results, to be honest. I flagged a couple of very bad cases to some organizations and they got back to the legal team. There were some cases of misuse of labels, some companies that were pretending to be working with some humanitarian organization, which they didn't. This is also coming from the lack of transparency in who you work with. So we already achieved some kind of small-scale silent results by stopping some of these misbehavior. But a lot remains to be done, and we will try to achieve that. Maybe the next step will be potentially engaging in RightsCon next year, trying to bring together a session with tech companies and work through those challenges and some of these issues.
So going back to a second question from Liam, you write in the recommendations to donors, quote, "We call on donors to avoid encouraging tech solutionism," end quote. Can you say more about that? How can it be done?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was distracted by a very funny comment in the chat. I have to be completely honest.
Fair point. The comments in the chat have been quite good. So the question is that you write in the recommendations to donors, quote, "We call on donors to avoid encouraging tech solutionism," end quote. Can you say more about that and how can that be done?
It can be done by being aware that pushing for some technologies is not necessarily a good idea. So if I can give countless examples of donors setting up their innovation hubs and then launching a big research on AI for good, blockchain for good, this for good, that for good. That is kind of a sign. That is like the Batman signal in the sky for humanitarian actors that they need to put money on that solution because that donor is interested in those solutions. So even though they don't write into the grant applications, please put AI into your proposal, but you're sending a signal. And some of these are like pride endeavor, like the donor just want to show off that they are edgy and they do want to show that they are on top of the game, that they know about AI, that they are informing their policies. So they pay consultants to develop a study on how humanitarianism is managing AI. The final result is that everybody has to spin off some sorts of AI-based stuff. And this is what I mentioned by techno-solutionism. So basically everybody is looking for a nail because they have a hammer, and then this has to stop. A good way will be for donors to be more deliberate in the way they frame their discussion about technology, discussing more about what is the best way to achieve this obstacle, this challenge. I want you to show me that you deploy the best stack. I want you to show me that you deploy the best solutions. But that requires a lot of work internally to be able to understand and decipher what is the best solution, what is the best stack, so it takes two to tango. So humanitarians need to be better at resisting that kind of sign, this signal, and the donors need to be more open in realizing that maybe they don't know everything, and they need to learn, and they need to trust. They need to trust that humanitarians are doing their homework, maybe putting some barriers on the side, some requirements, but they need to not be pushy about the kind of technology that is adopted.
And we have time for our last question here, which is from Ray. They ask, did you uncover good examples of organizations or companies that are using user-centric design principles for building digital solutions, putting the end user at the forefront rather than a technology looking for a problem to solve?
This is an excellent reflection. Yes, I found many organizations doing user-centered design, but that's not enough. User-centered design is not enough. It's cosmetic, and we've been dreaming about the possibility of fixing a systemic problem by asking people what do they think about it, but that's not enough. When you come to Zoom keep changing my audio settings, so that's why sometimes I'm a little bit taken aback. Apologies for that. When you come to a community that is in extreme dire need and you need to design a solution based on your own tech stack, and you come with a proposal, everything that you can wiggle around is a little bit of the interface, is a little bit of the user interface, is a little bit of the flow. But first of all, these are not guinea pigs. Like, these are people that are in need. So it's complicated because on one side, they should be the one driving the technology, but they should be the one driving the technology based on their needs. But how do you do that when you talk about AI that was developed like 5 years ago? Like, the first training model started before the crisis was even started. How do you do that? And if you involve them too much, then basically you're harvesting their data to improve the mechanism and the algorithms, which is a multi-billion business model. So you're basically commodifying their needs and their wishes for big tech. So it's a very complex game that we are entering here. That's also why it calls for pause and reflection in terms of what is the role that we want to play. And user-centered design doesn't cut it. At least that's my feeling.
Well, we're just about at time, so I want to say thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, a fantastic discussion. Thank you to those of us who joined us and for asking very good questions. So we'll wrap up right here, and we look forward to seeing where we go from this point forward. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.